On the humid morning of February the 23rd, 1968, 12 American soldiers walked into hell and never came back the same. What happened in the tangled jungle outside Tay Ninh Province that day was so catastrophic, so politically inconvenient, that it would be classified, redacted, and deliberately erased from public memory for half a century. The families were told their sons died heroes. They were never told the truth about who sent them there to die. This is that truth. The war in Vietnam had already devoured 50,000 American lives by early 1968. The Tet Offensive launched just 3 weeks earlier had shattered the illusion that America was winning. Cities across South Vietnam had erupted in coordinated attacks. Saigon itself had been breached. The American public watched their televisions in horror, as the war they were told was nearly over revealed itself as a nightmare with no end in sight. But while cameras focused on Hue and Khe Sanh, a smaller tragedy was being written in blood, 30 miles northwest of Saigon. Second Lieutenant Marcus Webb of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had been in country for exactly 47 days. Fresh out of officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia, he'd arrived in Vietnam believing in the mission. In the domino theory, in American exceptionalism, his platoon, part of Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, consisted of 31 men. Most were draftees. The youngest was 18, the oldest was 23. Webb's orders came down through battalion command on the evening of February the 22nd. A listening post had intercepted radio chatter suggesting Viet Cong movement along a tributary of the Saigon River. Intelligence, if it could be called, dead indicated. A possible supply cache hidden in a village designated on maps as AP Tan Hung. The village didn't officially exist in South Vietnamese records. That should have been the first warning. The mission briefing lasted 11 minutes. Webb would take a reinforced Squad 12 men in, a reconnaissance patrol at first light. They were to locate the cache, call in coordinates, and extract. Simple, routine. The kind of patrol that had been run 1,000 times before. Nobody mentioned that the area had been declared a free fire zone 2 months earlier. Nobody mentioned that 3 previous patrols had reported heavy enemy presence within a 5-kilometer radius. Nobody mentioned that battalion command was under crushing pressure from division to produce results, any results too. Counter the public relations disaster of Tet. This detail is confirmed in a wartime report from the New York Times archives, which later revealed systematic pressure on junior officers to conduct aggressive operations despite inadequate intelligence. Webb selected his men that night. Sergeant William Billy Kowalski, a farm kid from Iowa, on his second tour, would serve as point man. Corporal James Rodriguez from Los Angeles would walk slack. Private First Class Tyrone Hayes, a 19-year-old from Detroit who'd been drafted 6 months after graduating high school, carried the M60 machine gun. The others, Thompson, Martinelli, Washington, Cruz, O'Brien, Novak, Spencer, and Private Daniel Kraft, the youngest at 18, would round out the patrol. They left Firebase Pershing at 0-5-30 hours, February the 23rd. The jungle swallowed them within minutes. The heat was already oppressive by 0700. The canopy blocked most sunlight but trapped the humidity like a greenhouse. Every step required machetes to hack through wait-a-minute vines and elephant grass that could shred exposed skin. The air smelled of rot and red clay and something else, something chemical and wrong that old-timers said you learned to recognize as death. Kowalski moved with the cautious grace of a man who'd survived 13 months of this hell already. He'd frozen twice in the first hour, hand raised in a fist, the universal signal for stop. Both times it had been nothing, a monitor lizard, a troop of monkeys, but his instincts were screaming. The jungle was too quiet. By 0900, they'd covered less than 3 kilometers. The terrain had degraded into swamp. The men were calf-deep in stagnant water, leeches already latching onto any exposed skin. Webb checked his map again, though he knew it was worthless. The map had been drawn by French cartographers in 1954 and hadn't been updated since. That's when Rodriguez spotted the first body, a Viet Cong fighter, dead perhaps 3 days, half submerged in brackish water. The corpse was bloated, unrecognizable. But Rodriguez recognized the weapon beside it as Soviet AK-47. Fresh oil on the barrel. Recently maintained. Webb made his first critical decision. He radioed Firebase Pershing. Static. He tried again. More static. The jungle and the humidity were playing havoc with communications. He had two choices: abort and return, or push forward another click to higher ground where he could establish clear comms. He chose to push forward. It was the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They walked directly into the kill zone at 0-9-40-2. The ambush was textbook perfect. The Viet Cong had been tracking them since they'd left the firebase, had let them penetrate deep into terrain the Americans couldn't possibly hold. The first burst of a K-47 fire came from three sides simultaneously. Kowalski went down in the opening seconds, rounds stitching across his chest. He died before his body hit the water. The jungle exploded. Muzzle flashes erupted from spider holes invisible seconds before. RPG rounds screamed overhead. The Americans dove for whatever cover existed: fallen logs, shallow depressions, nothing that could actually stop bullets. Hayes swung the M62 toward the tree line and opened fire, the weapon's roar briefly drowning out the chaos. Spent brass arced through humid air. Spaced rounds cut geometric patterns through green shadow. Webb screamed into his radio. Still nothing but static, and his own voice echoing back. They were alone. 3,000 meters from the nearest friendly unit, surrounded by an enemy force he couldn't even count. Rodriguez took shrapnel in the leg from an RPG that detonated against a tree trunk. The blast threw him backwards into the swamp. Thompson crawled to him through fire that chewed up the earth in foot-high geysers. Martinelli was hit in the shoulder, still firing his M16 one-handed. O'Brien was crying, not from fear but from rage, changing magazines with shaking hands. The firefight lasted 8 minutes. That felt like 8 hours. Then, as suddenly as it began, the firing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, broken only by American voices calling out, checking who was still alive, who needed a medic, who was gone. Kowalski was dead. Private Kraft was dead. The 18-year-old had taken a round through the throat and bled out in seconds. Washington was missing his left hand, the stump wrapped in a bandage already soaked through. Cruz had taken rounds to both legs. Rodriguez couldn't walk. Martinelli could barely hold his weapon. Half of Webb's patrol was dead or critically wounded, and they were still 3 kilometers from extraction in terrain the enemy owned. Webb got the radio working at 0-10-15 from a slight rise that barely qualified as high ground. His voice was steady when he called in the contact report, requesting immediate medevac and reinforcement. The response from battalion shattered whatever faith he had left in the chain of command. Medevac would take 45 minutes minimum. Gunship support was unavailable, committed to operations near Dao Tiang. Ground reinforcement couldn't be spared. Webb's patrol was ordered to move to an alternate landing zone 1.5 kilometers south and wait for extraction. 1.5 kilometers. Through hostile jungle. Carrying 4 critically wounded men, with 6 combat-effective soldiers remaining. Webb looked at his men. Boys, really? Most of them made a decision that would define the rest of his life. They would move, but they would move together. No one gets left behind. The march to the alternate LZ took 3 hours and cost them everything they had. They moved in bounds, 2 men providing cover while the others carried the wounded. Hayes refused to abandon the M60, dragging the 23-pound weapon through mud and thorns. Novak and O'Brien carried Washington between them, the man drifting in and out of consciousness. Spencer had fashioned a stretcher from ponchos and branches for Cruz. The Viet Cong harassed them the entire way. Not a full assault, but probing attacks, bursts of automatic fire from hidden positions. Forcing the Americans to drop and return fire, burning through ammunition they couldn't spare. It was psychological warfare at its most effective. The enemy wanted them to panic, to scatter, to make mistakes. Webb held them together through sheer force of will. By 1300 hours, they'd reached the alternate Elzea bomb crater from a previous airstrike. Maybe 30 meters across, offering 0 concealment. They arranged the wounded in the center and established a perimeter with their remaining ammunition. Hayes positioned the M60 covering the most likely avenue of approach. Then they waited. The medevac appeared at 1347, a single. Huey with door gunners and a pilot. Webb would later learn was named Captain Robert Jensen, warrant officer from Montana on his 3rd tour. Jensen brought the bird in through ground fire that shredded the tail boom and cracked the windscreen. The door gunners laid down suppressing fire while Webb's men loaded the wounded. There was room for 6. Webb had 6 wounded and 6 combat effective remaining. Simple math that tore at every leadership principle he'd been taught. "Get him out," Webb told Rodriguez, pushing the wounded corporal toward the bird. "We'll wait for the next one." Rodriguez grabbed Webb's collar. "Sir, don't be a goddamn hero. Get on the bird." "That's an order, Corporal." Jensen was screaming that they had to go, taking fire from multiple directions. The Huey's turbines screamed. Webb physically pushed Rodriguez aboard and slapped the hull. The bird lifted, tilted, and clawed for altitude through tracers that carved the air into sections. Webb, Hayes, Martinelli, Thompson, Spencer, and Novak 6 men watched it disappear into haze. The second bird never came. What happened next was buried in classified after-action reports that wouldn't be declassified until 1998, and even then, only partially. Radio logs from Firebase Pershing show that Battalion Command ordered all available helicopter assets diverted to a developing situation near Tay Ninh West. Webb's team was designated secondary priority, military jargon for expendable. The 6 remaining Americans held that bomb crater for 7 hours. The Viet Cong attacked twice more, once at 14:30, a probing assault that Hayes broke up with the M60. And again, at 1600, a coordinated assault from 2 directions that nearly overran their position. Thompson was killed in that attack, shot through the head while covering Martinelli's reload. Spencer took shrapnel that left him partially blinded. By 1800, as equatorial darkness fell like a curtain, they'd expended 90% of their ammunition. Hayes had maybe 50 rounds left for the M60. The riflemen had 1 magazine each, had no food, water was running out, and they could hear Vietnamese voices in the jungle around them. It's close enough to make out individual words none of them understood. Webb gathered his for remaining men. Martinelli could barely move his shattered shoulder. Spencer could see from only one eye. Novak was shaking so hard his teeth chattered, and Hayes just stared into the darkness with the M60 across his lap. "We're moving," Webb said. "Now, under cover of darkness, we navigate by compass to Firebase Pershing. 8 kilometers. Move, we stay quiet, and we survive." Clear, no one argued. There was nothing left to argue with. They walked through the night, not in a straight line that would have been suicide, but in a zigzag pattern. Moving between water sources, using every technique Webb could remember from survival training. Twice they froze as Viet Cong patrols passed within meters. Once they lay in a stream for 45 minutes, submerged to their noses, while an enemy squad stopped to rest directly overhead. Hayes carried the M60 the entire way, refusing to abandon it even when Martinelli begged him to drop the weight. "I carried it in," Hayes whispered through cracked lips. "I'm carrying it out." They reached Firebase Pershing's outer perimeter at 0320 on February the 24th. The sentries nearly shot them. They looked like ghosts, covered in mud and blood, barely recognizable as American soldiers. The battalion commander refused to see them. Webb's after-action report was classified within hours. The families of Kowalski, Kraft, and Thompson received letters explaining their sons had died in combat operations, killed in action serving their country with honor. The truth that they'd been sent on an intelligence-light mission into a known enemy stronghold, then abandoned for 7 hours while command diverted resources elsewhere never appeared in any official document. The cover-up began immediately. Vision Command was facing a public relations nightmare after Tet. Stories of small units being ambushed and abandoned didn't fit the narrative they were trying to construct. Webb was ordered not to discuss the patrol outside official channels. When he persisted, requesting an investigation into why the second medevac never arrived, he was reassigned to a staff position and sent home 6 weeks later. The men who survived carried it differently. Hayes became an anti-war activist after his discharge, speaking at rallies, showing his scars. Martinelli never spoke about Vietnam again, not to his wife, not to his children. Spencer died by suicide in 1972. Novak drank himself to death by 1986. Rodriguez, who'd been on the first helicopter out, spent decades trying to get the story declassified. Webb lived until 2009. Before he died, he gave a series of interviews to military historians, finally telling the full story. By then, Vietnam was ancient history. The men who'd made the decisions that sent 12 soldiers into that jungle had retired with full honors. No one was ever held accountable. The forgotten battle remained forgotten, exactly as intended. But the men who were there, Those who survived and those who didn't, they deserved more than silence. They deserved a nation that told the truth about what happened to them and why, and who decided their lives were expendable. 50 years later, we owe them at least that much.